In a country where kidnappings have become a weapon of war, where families live in constant fear of losing their loved ones to armed groups that operate in the shadows, every phone call carries the weight of both hope and dread. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré's phone rings at 3 in the morning, with a message from a number he doesn't recognize, he has no way of knowing that the next 48 hours will test everything he has learned as a soldier and a leader. The voice on the recording belongs to his aunt Fatoumata, a woman who vanished 3 weeks ago while traveling to visit relatives in the northern regions. Her words are measured, controlled, clearly spoken under duress. But it's not what she says that will crack this case wide open. It's what can be heard in the background, sounds so subtle that most people would miss them entirely, sounds that will send Traoré and his team on a desperate race against time through some of the most dangerous territory in Burkina Faso. This is a story about listening beyond words, about finding hope in the smallest details, and about refusing to abandon family even when every rational calculation says the odds are impossible. Before we begin this incredible story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. Chapter 1. The Message. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not a man who slept easily. The responsibilities of leadership in a country fighting a brutal insurgency meant that his mind was always working, always calculating, always preparing for the next crisis. So when his phone buzzed on the nightstand at 3:17 in the morning, he was awake instantly, his hand reaching for the device even as his eyes adjusted to the darkness of his bedroom in Ouagadougou. The screen showed an unknown number with a local area code. Traoré's first instinct was suspicion. Unknown calls at odd hours were rarely good news, and in his position they could be anything from intelligence reports to security threats. But something made him answer, some instinct he couldn't quite name. "This is Traoré," he said, his voice carefully neutral. There was no immediate response, just the faint hiss of static and what sounded like wind. Then a recorded voice began to play, automated and impersonal. "You have one new voice message. Message received at 2:43 a.m. What followed made Traoré's blood run cold. Ibrahim. The voice was unmistakable despite the strain in it, despite the tremor of fear barely held in check. "Ibrahim, this is your Aunt Fatoumata. I need you to listen carefully. They are allowing me to send this message to prove that I am alive, that I am unharmed. They want you to know that they are serious. They have demands, and they will contact you again with instructions. Please, Ibrahim, I know you are an important man now, a leader. They chose me because of you, because they know you have influence, access to resources. Please, do not let them hurt me. Do not let—" Her voice broke, and Traoré could hear her take a shaky breath before continuing. "I am being treated well enough. I am not hurt, but I am frightened, Ibrahim. So frightened. Please help me, please." The message cut off abruptly, replaced again by the automated voice. "End of message. To replay, press 1. To save, press 2. To delete." Traoré pressed 1, his hands trembling slightly as he sat up in bed, his mind already racing through implications and possibilities. As the message began to play again, he reached for the lamp on his nightstand and grabbed a notepad and pen, preparing to listen more carefully, to catch every detail. Fatoumata Traoré was his father's younger sister, a woman in her late 50s who had spent her life as a teacher in the rural schools of Burkina Faso. She had never married, dedicating herself instead to education and community service. She was gentle, kind, utterly apolitical, exactly the kind of person who should never have been caught up in the violent chaos that had engulfed the country. 3 weeks ago, she had left Ouagadougou to visit her sister in Djibo, a city in the Sahel region that had become one of the most dangerous places in Burkina Faso due to frequent attacks by jihadist groups. The family had warned her not to go, had begged her to wait until the security situation improved, but Fatoumata had been adamant. Her sister was ill, and family obligations took precedence over personal safety. She had never arrived in Djibo. The convoy she was traveling with had been attacked just outside the city. Most of the passengers had been released after being robbed, but Fatoumata and 3 others, 2 men and another woman, had been taken. The family had filed reports with the authorities, had contacted every organization they could think of, but there had been no word, no demands, no confirmation of whether she was even still alive. Until now, Traoré listened to the message 3 more times, each repetition adding new layers of understanding. His aunt's voice was controlled, suggesting she was reading from a script or had been coached on what to say. The reference to his influence and access to resources confirmed what he had suspected. This was not a random kidnapping. She had been targeted specifically because of her connection to him. But it was on the fourth listening that Traoré began to notice the background sounds. He had been focused on his aunt's words, on the emotional content of her message, but now he forced himself to listen to everything else, the ambient noise that surrounded her voice. There was wind, definitely wind. Not the gentle breeze of the city, but something stronger, more constant. It had that particular quality of wind across open spaces, across desert or savanna. That fit with what they knew. The insurgent groups operated primarily in the northern and eastern regions, where the landscape was dominated by sparse vegetation and seasonal riverbeds. But there was something else, something that came and went in the background, a rhythmic sound, almost musical. Traoré turned up the volume on his phone, held it close to his ear, and listened with absolute concentration. There, about 17 seconds into the message, a series of metallic clangs, regular and repeated. Clang, 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 pause, clang, clang, then silence again, buried under his aunt's voice. And later, near the end of the message, something else, a bird call, distinctive and clear. Traoré had grown up in the countryside, had spent enough time in the field to recognize many of the region's birds. This one sounded like a helmeted guinea fowl, common throughout Burkina Faso, but with particular habitat preferences. He grabbed his laptop and began to make notes, documenting everything he could hear in the message: wind patterns, the metallic sound, the bird call, the quality of the acoustics, which suggested his aunt was outdoors or in a structure with poor sound insulation, the absence of other human voices, which might mean she was being held in relative isolation from other captives, or in a location where the kidnappers maintained strict noise discipline. By the time the sun began to rise over Ouagadougou, Traoré had listened to the message 23 times. He had filled 4 pages with observations, questions, and hypotheses, and he had made a decision. He was not going to wait for official channels to handle this. He was not going to trust the slow machinery of bureaucracy and negotiation. His aunt had been taken because of him, because someone had identified her as leverage against Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader who had risen to prominence in Burkina Faso's complex political landscape. If they wanted to use her as leverage, they had miscalculated, because Traoré was not going to negotiate. He was going to find her. At 6 a.m., he called an emergency meeting of his most trusted officers. Lieutenant Sawadogo arrived first, followed quickly by Sergeant Ouedraogo and Captain Caboret, the intelligence specialist who had helped Traoré navigate countless complex situations over the past 2 years. "Gentlemen," Traoré began without preamble, "my Aunt Fatoumata has been kidnapped. I received a voice message from her kidnappers early this morning. I need your help to find her before they make their demands, before this becomes a hostage negotiation that could drag on for months while she suffers in captivity." He played the message for them, watching their faces as they absorbed the implications. When it finished, Sawadogo spoke first. "Sir, with all respect, shouldn't this go through proper channels? The anti-kidnapping task force has protocols for this kind of situation. If you intervene personally, it could complicate." "The anti-kidnapping task force has a success rate of approximately 12%, Traoré interrupted, his voice hard. 12%, Lieutenant. That means 88% of the time. Kidnapping victims either die in captivity, are killed during failed rescue attempts, or are held for months or years before being released in exchange for ransoms that fund more insurgent operations. I will not accept those odds for my aunt." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "But I'm not asking you to violate regulations or compromise your careers. What I'm asking is for you to help me analyze this message as if it were an intelligence asset. Help me find the clues in it. Then, if we identify a location, we can decide how to proceed, whether through official channels or otherwise." Caboret, the intelligence specialist, nodded slowly. "May I listen to the message again, this time on better equipment? If there are background sounds that might indicate location, we should use every technical resource available to isolate and identify them." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Traoré replied. They spent the next 3 hours in one of the military's audio analysis laboratories, a small room filled with sophisticated sound equipment that was normally used to analyze intercepted communications from insurgent groups. The message was uploaded to digital audio workstations that allowed them to manipulate the sound in ways that Traoré's phone never could. Traoré worked the controls with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years in signals intelligence. He isolated different frequency ranges, filtered out certain sounds, enhanced others. Slowly, the background noise that Traoré had barely been able to hear on his phone began to resolve into distinct, identifiable sounds. "There," Traoré said, pointing to a waveform on his screen. "That metallic sound you mentioned, it's definitely regular and it's definitely artificial, not natural. Let me enhance it." He adjusted several controls, and suddenly the sound was much clearer. Clang, 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 pause, clang, clang. "That's a bell," Ouedraogo said suddenly. "Not like a church bell, but something smaller. Maybe a goat bell or a cow bell." Traoré felt a surge of excitement. Livestock. They're being held somewhere near livestock. That narrows it down. We're not looking at a purely military camp or an urban location. We're looking at somewhere with a pastoral or agricultural presence. "Wait," Traoré interrupted, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "There's more. Listen to this." He isolated another section of the audio, this time focusing on a frequency range that was almost below normal human hearing. When he enhanced it, they could all hear a deep, rhythmic sound. Thrum, thrum, thrum. "What is that?" Ouedraogo asked, frowning. "I think—" Traoré paused, playing the section again. "I think that's a generator, a diesel generator, probably old and not well maintained, based on the irregular rhythm. That suggests they have some electrical power, but not grid access. We're definitely looking at a rural location." They continued working through the morning, identifying and cataloging every sound they could isolate from the 47-second message. By noon, they had compiled an impressive list. Wind consistent, suggesting open terrain, possibly elevated. Livestock bells. Multiple animals, probably goats based on the pitch. Diesel generator. Irregular rhythm, indicating age or poor maintenance. Helmeted guinea fowl, specific species with known habitat preferences. Acoustic quality. Outdoor or poorly insulated structure. Absence of traffic noise. Urban sounds, trace or multiple human voices. Now we need to cross-reference this with what we know about insurgent activity in the region, Traoré said, spreading maps across the table. The convoy was attacked here, just outside Djibo. Most kidnapping victims are held within 50 to 100 kilometers of where they're taken. The groups don't want to risk moving them too far because of security checkpoints and air surveillance. Traoré began marking areas on the map. If we're looking for elevated terrain with pastoral activity, diesel generators, and the right habitat for guinea fowl, that eliminates a lot of possibilities. Most of the immediate area around Djibo is flat Sahel, but there are some low hills to the east and northeast. "The generator is interesting," Ouedraogo added. "Not many places in that region have generators. Most villages either have grid power or no power at all. Generators suggest a location with some infrastructure, but outside the grid, maybe an abandoned mining site or a former government outpost." Traoré felt the pieces starting to come together. Abandoned government outposts. How many of those are there in the region around Djibo? Traoré pulled up a database. In the 50-kilometer radius, 7 official outposts that were abandoned between 2018 and 2023 due to security concerns. Most were agricultural extension offices or forestry service stations. Let me cross-reference with terrain elevation and pastoral activity. The room fell silent, except for the clicking of Traoré's keyboard as he worked through the data. After several minutes, he looked up, his expression grave. "I have 3 possible locations that fit all the criteria. All of them are former government facilities. All have some elevation. All are in areas with active pastoral communities. But, sir, there's a problem. All 3 are in territory that's heavily contested. We don't have regular military presence in any of these areas. If we're right about the location, getting there and getting your aunt out safely is going to be extremely difficult." Traoré studied the map, looking at the 3 marked locations. He felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, the knowledge that his next decision could mean life or death, not just for his aunt, but potentially for any soldiers he asked to accompany him into hostile territory. "So I need 24 hours, he said finally. 24 hours to plan this properly, to gather the resources we'll need, to confirm which of these 3 locations is most likely. We move carefully, but we move quickly. Because whoever sent that message is going to call back soon with demands, and I want to be ready to act before they realize we're not negotiating." As his team began to disperse to handle their assigned tasks, Traoré remained in the audio lab, playing the message one more time. His aunt's frightened voice filled the small room, and he felt a wave of anger and determination wash over him. "I'm coming for you, Aunt Fatoumata," he whispered to the empty room. "Whatever it takes, I'm coming." Chapter 2. Listening to the silence. Over the next 12 hours, Traoré assembled a team and resources for what he was starting to call Operation Guinea Fowl, a private acknowledgement of the bird call that might prove crucial to finding his aunt. But even as he coordinated logistics and reviewed intelligence reports, his mind kept returning to the voice message, to the sounds he and Caboret had isolated, and to the sounds they hadn't been able to identify. At 8 p.m., he returned to the audio lab alone. The building was quiet, most of the staff having gone home for the evening. Traoré appreciated the solitude. It gave him space to think, to listen without distractions, to focus on details he might have missed earlier. He loaded the message onto the audio workstation and put on professional headphones, the kind that cancelled out all external noise and reproduced every frequency with perfect clarity. Then he closed his eyes and listened again, this time not for what was there, but for what was missing. The first thing he noticed was the lack of children's voices. Kidnapping camps often held multiple captives, including families with children. The absence of young voices suggested either that his aunt was being held separately from other hostages, or that the kidnappers were maintaining strict segregation and noise discipline. The second thing was the quality of his aunt's voice itself. She sounded frightened. Yes, but not physically injured. Her breathing was steady, her words clearly enunciated. This suggested she was being treated relatively well, at least for now. But there was something else in her voice, something that made Traoré play that section again and again. "Please help me, please." The message cut off abruptly after the second "please." Too abruptly, Traoré realized. His aunt had been in the middle of a word, in the middle of a thought. Someone had stopped the recording manually, hadn't just let it run out naturally. Why? He backed up the recording and listened to the seconds immediately before the cutoff. His aunt's voice, "Please help me, please don't..." No, wait. Traoré enhanced that section, isolating just her voice. "Please help me, please don't let..." Then the cut. "Don't let what?" "Don't let them hurt me." She had already said she wasn't hurt. "Don't let them..." Something else. Traoré felt frustration building. The kidnappers had cut the message before his aunt could finish that thought. But why? What had she been about to say that they didn't want him to hear? He shifted his focus to the very beginning of the message, before his aunt started speaking. There were 4 seconds of ambient sound, just the wind, the distant generator, the livestock bells. But was there something else? Some sound so quiet or so brief that they hadn't noticed it in their earlier analysis. Traoré applied a new set of filters, eliminating the known sounds and boosting everything else. And there, buried in the first 2 seconds of the recording, he heard it. Voices. Not his aunt's voice, but at least 2 other people talking in the background. Too distant and too quiet to make out words, but definitely human voices. One of the voices was deeper, male. The other was higher pitched, possibly female, possibly a younger male. They seemed to be arguing about something, their tone urgent even though the words were indistinct. Traoré isolated that section and enhanced it as much as the software would allow without introducing too much distortion. The voices became slightly clearer, but the language was still impossible to make out. He thought it might be Maori, the most common language in Burkina Faso, but he couldn't be certain. He was so focused on this analysis that he didn't hear the door open behind him until a voice spoke. "Captain? I thought I might find you here." Traoré turned to see Captain Caboret standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I figured you'd be back, trying to squeeze more information out of that message. Brought you this." He handed 1 cup to Traoré. "What have you found?" "Voices," Traoré said, gesturing to the screen. In the first 2 seconds of the recording, before Aunt Fatoumata starts speaking, At least two people arguing about something. I can't make out what they're saying, but they sound, I don't know, agitated. Cabaret set down his coffee and took Traoré's seat at the workstation. Let me hear it. They listened together, Cabaret's trained ear picking up details that Traoré had missed. After several repetitions, the intelligence specialist sat back with a thoughtful expression. That's interesting. The deeper voice. I think I can make out one word. Listen here. He isolated a specific moment and played it 3 times. Does that sound like Bulsa to you? Traoré listened carefully. Maybe. What's Bulsa? It's a town about 90 kilometers south of Djibo. Not huge, but it has some significance. There's a large weekly market there, and it's on one of the main routes between Ouagadougou and the northern regions. Cabaret pulled up a map on a second screen. But here's what's interesting. Of our 3 possible locations for where your aunt is being held, the closest one to Bulsa is this abandoned forestry station, about 23 kilometers east of the town. He zoomed in on the location. The station was shut down in 2021 after repeated attacks by insurgent groups. It sits on a small plateau, has several buildings that could house captives, and according to our records, it had its own diesel generator because it was outside the power grid. It checks almost every box from our earlier analysis. Traoré felt his pulse quicken. Almost. The one thing we couldn't confirm is the livestock presence. The forestry station wasn't in an area known for pastoral activity, but Cabaret zoomed out slightly on the map, revealing the surrounding terrain. About 2 kilometers to the north, there's a seasonal grazing area that herders use during certain times of the year. If there are goat herders there now, the bells we heard could be from their animals. What are the odds we're right about this location? Traoré asked. Cabaret considered the question carefully. Based purely on the audio analysis and geographical data, I'd say 60 to maybe 70%, which isn't certainty, but it's significantly better odds than we usually get in these situations. Most kidnapping rescues involve either pure luck or information from informants. We rarely have this much technical evidence to work with. Traoré stood and began pacing, a habit he had when thinking through difficult decisions. Chas, if we're wrong, if we commit resources to raiding the wrong location, we might spook the kidnappers into moving Aunt Fatoumata or worse. But if we're right, and we don't act quickly, they're going to make their demands soon, and then we're into a negotiation that could last months. There might be a way to improve our odds, Cabaret said slowly. It would take most of the night, but I could run the audio through some additional analysis software, programs designed to identify specific geographical acoustic signatures. Different regions have different sound profiles based on things like altitude, humidity, wind patterns, even the mineral composition of the soil. If I can build a more precise acoustic fingerprint of where that message was recorded, we might be able to narrow down the location even further. Do it, Traoré said immediately. I'll stay here and help. What do you need? They worked through the night, running the recording through increasingly sophisticated analysis programs. Some of the software had been designed for geological surveys, using sound waves to map underground mineral deposits. Other programs were meteorological tools that analyzed wind patterns and atmospheric conditions. All of them had been repurposed for this single goal, identifying exactly where Fatoumata Traoré was being held captive. By 3 a.m., they had their answer. The acoustic signature is a 92% match for elevated terrain in the Bulsa region, Cabaret announced, exhaustion and excitement mixing in his voice. The wind patterns, the way sound travels in that recording, it all points to an altitude of between 60 and 80 meters above the surrounding plain. That's exactly the elevation of the plateau where the old forestry station is located. Traoré looked at the data displayed across multiple screens, at the graphs and charts and probability calculations that all pointed to the same conclusion. 92%, he said quietly. That's as close to certainty as we're going to get. There's one more thing, Cabaret said, pulling up a satellite image. I requested updated reconnaissance photos of the forestry station through back channels. They came in about an hour ago. He pointed to several details in the image. See these? Vehicle tracks, recent enough to show up clearly. And here, smoke from what looks like a cooking fire. Someone is definitely using this facility, and recently, the satellite images showed a compound consisting of 4 main buildings arranged around a central courtyard, surrounded by a deteriorating fence. Several vehicles were parked in the shade of trees near the largest building. The image quality wasn't high enough to identify individuals, but the presence of activity at an abandoned facility was telling. "How many people can you see evidence of?" Traoré asked. "Hard to say definitively, but based on the number of vehicles and the size of the cooking area, I'd estimate between 15 and 25 people, consistent with a mid-sized insurgent cell or a kidnapping operation with multiple hostages and guards." Traoré pulled out his phone and checked the time. "It's been just over 24 hours since I received the message. In my experience, kidnappers usually wait at least 48 hours between initial contact and demands. It's psychological, meant to increase anxiety and make the target more compliant. That gives us maybe another 12 to 24 hours before they call back." He turned to face Cabaret directly. "I want to move on this location today. I want to plan a raid, assemble a team, and execute the rescue before the kidnappers expect any action. Are you with me?" Cabaret met his gaze steadily. "You know the regulations, sir. Technically, this should go through the anti-kidnapping task force. If you proceed independently and something goes wrong, there could be serious consequences for your career." "I know," Traoré said simply, "but she's my aunt. She was taken because of me, and I have information that the official channels don't have. Every hour we delay is another hour she spends in captivity, another hour something could go wrong. I'm not willing to accept that risk." Cabaret nodded slowly. "Then we'd better start planning, because if we're going to do this, we need to do it perfectly. No mistakes, no compromises. We get one shot at this." As the sun began to rise over Ouagadougou for the second day since Traoré had received the message, the two officers began to lay out the framework for Operation Guinea Fowl. They would need vehicles, weapons, a small team of absolutely trustworthy soldiers, medical supplies in case hostages or team members were injured, and most importantly, a plan that could adapt to whatever they found at the forestry station. But even as they worked through the tactical details, Traoré's mind kept returning to that moment in the message where his aunt had been cut off mid-sentence. Please don't let what, Aunt Fatoumata?" he wondered. "What were you trying to tell me before they stopped the recording?" He would find out soon enough. In less than 12 hours, if everything went according to plan, he would be at that forestry station, and then, one way or another, he would have his answers. So Chapter 3. Assembling the Team. The morning briefing room at military headquarters was deliberately chosen for its isolation. Located in a basement level with reinforced walls originally designed for secure communications during emergencies, it was one of the few places in the building where Traoré could be certain their conversation wouldn't be overheard or monitored. He had called in 6 people, the absolute minimum needed for the operation, and the only soldiers he trusted completely, with both his life and his career. They sat around the metal table, coffee cups in hand, waiting for him to explain why they had been summoned on such short notice. Lieutenant Sawadogo was there, of course. The young officer had been with Traoré through multiple operations and had proven himself reliable under fire. Sergeant Ouedraogo, the tracker and field specialist who could read terrain like others read books. Captain Cabaret, whose intelligence work had been crucial in analyzing the voice message. Corporal Aminata Diallo, a communications specialist who had grown up in the Sahel region and knew the area around Bulsa intimately. Sergeant Issouf Zongo, a medic with combat experience who could handle anything from gunshot wounds to traumatic injuries. And finally, Private First Class Moussa Kabore, no relation to the captain, a young soldier with an almost supernatural ability with vehicles and mechanical systems. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Traoré began, standing at the head of the table. Behind him, a large map of the region around Bulsa was displayed on a screen. "What I'm about to tell you is sensitive, and participation in what follows is entirely voluntary. If anyone wants to leave after hearing the details, there will be no consequences and no questions asked." He paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. No one moved. 3 weeks ago, my Aunt Fatoumata was kidnapped by insurgents while traveling to Djibo. Yesterday morning, I received a voice message from her captors, proof of life, meant to set up future ransom demands. But that message contained something they didn't intend to include, enough ambient sound to give us a strong probability of where she's being held. Traoré gestured to the map. Captain Kabore and I spent last night analyzing every sound in that recording, based on acoustic signatures, satellite imagery, and geographical data. We believe she's being held here, at an abandoned forestry station 23 kilometers east of Bulsa. He let that information sink in before continuing. The problem is timing. Standard protocol would be to report this to the anti-kidnapping task force and let them handle it through official channels. But that process takes time, days or weeks to verify intelligence, plan operations, coordinate resources. Meanwhile, the kidnappers will make their demands within the next 24 hours, and once we're in active negotiations, a military rescue becomes exponentially more complicated. Sawadogo leaned forward. So you want to move before they make their demands. Hit the location while they still think they control the situation. Exactly, Traoré confirmed. We have a window, probably less than 18 hours, to execute a rescue operation before this becomes a hostage crisis. But I need to be clear about what I'm asking. This operation would be unauthorized. We'd be acting on intelligence that hasn't been verified through official channels, hitting a target in contested territory without backup or air support. If something goes wrong, there will be consequences, for me certainly, but potentially for everyone involved. Sergeant Zongo, the medic, spoke up. Sir, with respect, you're not asking us to do anything illegal or immoral. You're proposing a rescue mission to save an innocent civilian from kidnappers. The only question is whether we follow the book or follow our conscience. For me, that's not actually a difficult choice. There were nods of agreement around the table. Corporal Diallo raised her hand slightly. I grew up near Bulsa. I know that area, know the people, know the terrain. If there's even a chance we can bring someone home safely, we should take it. The official channels, they mean well, but they move slowly. And in situations like this, time is life. I'm in, Ouedraogo said simply. You pulled me out of a bad situation in Kaya 2 years ago, Captain. I owe you, but more than that, this is the right thing to do. One by one, the others voiced their commitment. Within 5 minutes, Traoré had his team. All right, he said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, even as another settled in its place. Here's how we do this. We leave Ouagadougou in 3 hours, 1400 hours exactly. That puts us in the vicinity of the forestry station around dusk, which gives us the cover of approaching darkness for the assault, but enough light for the initial reconnaissance. He pulled up a detailed satellite image of the forestry station. 4 main buildings, central courtyard, deteriorating perimeter fence. Based on vehicle count and other indicators, we estimate 15 to 25 hostiles. We don't know how many hostages they're holding. Could be just Aunt Fatoumata, could be the 3 others taken with her, could be additional people from other kidnappings. Traoré took over the briefing. Intelligence suggests this may be a splinter group, not one of the major insurgent organizations like JNIM, but a smaller cell operating semi-independently. That's both good and bad for us. Good because they probably have less training, fewer resources, and weaker command structure. Bad because splinter groups are unpredictable. They don't always follow the established patterns we've learned to anticipate. Our approach will be in 2 phases, Traoré continued. Phase 1, reconnaissance and confirmation. We get eyes on the target, verify that hostages are actually there, assess the security situation, and finalize our assault plan. Phase 2, the rescue itself. Speed, precision, overwhelming force. We go in hard and fast, neutralize the guards, secure the hostages, and extract before they can organize a coherent response. He pulled up a topographical map. The forestry station sits on a plateau about 70 meters above the surrounding terrain. There are 3 main approaches, from the south, along what used to be the access road, from the east through rougher terrain, and from the north through the seasonal grazing lands. We'll approach from the east, using the terrain for cover, and establish an observation post here. He pointed to a cluster of large rocks about 800 meters from the compound. Once we've confirmed the situation, we move to assault positions and execute on my signal. Private Musa raised his hand. Sir, what about vehicles? If we're doing this off-book, we can't exactly requisition military transport. Traoré had anticipated this question. We'll use civilian vehicles. I've already arranged for 2 land cruisers through a contact who doesn't ask questions. They're rugged enough for the terrain, common enough not to draw attention, and have 4-wheel drive for the approach to the plateau. Musa, you'll be our primary driver and responsible for vehicle maintenance and rapid extraction if needed. Weapons? Sawadogo asked. Personal sidearms and assault rifles. Nothing heavy that would be difficult to explain if we're stopped at a checkpoint. We're posing as a mining survey team if anyone asks questions. Cabaret has prepared false documentation that should hold up to casual inspection. Corporal Diallo studied the map intently. The seasonal grazing area to the north, if there are herders there, they could be a complication. They might be sympathetic to the insurgents, or they might be intimidated into reporting our presence. We need a plan for managing potential witnesses. Good point, Traoré acknowledged. That's where your local knowledge becomes crucial, Corporal. During the reconnaissance phase, I want you to determine if there are active herding operations in the area. If so, we need to assess whether they're hostile, neutral, or potential allies. In the Sahel, pastoral communities are often caught between insurgents and security forces. They might be willing to help us if we approach correctly. He pulled out a timeline he and Cabaret had worked out during the early morning hours. Here's our schedule. 1400. Depart Ouagadougou. 1730. Arrive vicinity of Bulsa. Link up with a local contact who will provide final intelligence update. 1800. Move to observation position near forestry station. 1830 to 2000. Reconnaissance and planning. 2000 to 2100. Final preparations and team brief. 2100. Assault begins. 2200. Extraction with hostages. 2300. Clear the immediate area. Midnight. Rendezvous point for medical assessment and decision on next steps. Sergeant Zongo, the medic, pulled out a notepad. Medical considerations. I'll prepare trauma kits for potential gunshot wounds, but we should also plan for the hostages. Condition. If your aunt has been held for 3 weeks, she may be dehydrated, malnourished, possibly injured or ill. The other hostages could be in worse condition depending on how long they've been held. We'll need IV fluids, antibiotics, and capacity to handle multiple casualties if the assault goes badly. Agreed, Traoré said. Pack for worst-case scenarios. I'd rather carry extra medical supplies we don't need than need supplies we don't have. They spent the next 2 hours going through every detail of the operation: equipment lists, communication protocols, rules of engagement, contingency plans for various scenarios, escape routes if the mission was compromised, and procedures for casualties both friendly and hostile. Traoré was particularly insistent on the rules of engagement. We are not there to kill insurgents, he emphasized. We are there to rescue hostages. Lethal force is authorized only in defense of hostages or team members. If guards surrender or flee, we let them go. Our objective is extraction, not body count. Is that understood? Everyone nodded, though Traoré could see some hesitation in a few faces. The insurgent groups they would be facing had committed terrible atrocities against civilians and soldiers alike. It would be tempting to see this operation as an opportunity for revenge. But Traoré had learned that revenge was a luxury that professional soldiers couldn't afford. It clouded judgment, created complications, and often resulted in outcomes that haunted you for years. One more thing, Traoré said as the briefing began to wrap up. I need you all to write letters. Letters to be opened only if something goes wrong and you don't come back. Explain to your families why you chose to participate in this operation, what it meant to you, why you believed it was worth the risk. Give those letters to someone you trust. Not someone on this team, but someone outside the operation who can deliver them if necessary. The room fell silent. The request brought home the reality of what they were about to do in a way that all the tactical planning hadn't quite managed. This was dangerous. People could die. And if the operation went catastrophically wrong, their families would deserve to know why. I've already written mine, Traoré continued quietly, to my father, explaining why I felt I had to do this personally rather than through official channels. It doesn't make the risk acceptable, but it at least makes it comprehensible. I ask you to do the same for your loved ones. As the meeting broke up and the team members dispersed to prepare their equipment and write their letters, Cabaret lingered behind with Traoré. You know, the intelligence officer said thoughtfully, there's still time to change your mind, to take this intelligence to the task force and let them handle it officially. You've already broken new ground by identifying the location so quickly. That's valuable work that would save lives even if you're not the one who executes the rescue. Traoré considered the suggestion seriously. Cabaret was right. He could still walk back from the edge, could still choose the safer path that protected his career and reputation. But when he closed his eyes, He heard his aunt's voice on that recording, the fear barely concealed beneath her controlled words. The sentence cut off mid-thought. "Please don't let—" "I can't," he said finally. "I know the logical arguments. I know the risks. But she was taken because of me, Traoré. They chose her specifically to use as leverage against Captain Ibrahim Traoré. If I let bureaucracy and procedure dictate the pace of her rescue while she suffers in captivity, I'm not sure I could live with that. Some decisions have to be made with the heart, not just the head." Traoré smiled slightly. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been preparing for this operation assuming you'd go through with it regardless of the obstacles, and I think we have a real chance of pulling this off successfully." "What makes you think so?" "Because you're not doing this rashly or emotionally. You're doing it deliberately, with proper planning, with a good team, and with better intelligence than most official operations have access to. The rules exist for good reasons, but sometimes the situation demands that we think beyond the rules. I think this is one of those times." They shook hands, a gesture of mutual commitment and trust. Then Traoré departed to finalize equipment and logistics, leaving Traoré alone in the briefing room. He sat down at the table and pulled out his phone, looking at it for a long moment before pulling up his father's contact information. He should call, should tell Joseph Traoré what he was about to do. His father deserved to know that his son was risking everything to rescue his sister. But what would he say? That he was launching an unauthorized military operation based on sounds in a voice message? That he was gambling his career and possibly his life on acoustic analysis and satellite photos? His father would try to talk him out of it, would argue for patience and official channels, would fear losing his son the same way he had once feared losing his brother Musa. Traoré put the phone away without making the call. There would be time for explanations later, after Aunt Fatoumata was safe, after the mission was complete, after he could present his father with success rather than intentions. Instead, he pulled out a notebook and began writing his letter, the words coming slowly but steadily as he tried to articulate what had driven him to this point. Why family mattered, why some risks were worth taking, why leadership sometimes meant stepping beyond the boundaries of protocol when conscience demanded it. By the time he finished, it was nearly noon. He had 3 hours before departure, 3 hours to second-guess himself, to imagine everything that could go wrong, to calculate the odds of success versus the cost of failure. But he was done calculating. He was done weighing options and considering alternatives. His aunt needed him. His team believed in the mission. And somewhere in that abandoned forestry station east of Bulsa, Fatoumata Traoré was waiting for someone to care enough to come for her. Traoré sealed the letter in an envelope, wrote his father's name on it, and gave it to his administrative assistant with instructions that it should only be opened if he failed to return within 48 hours. Then he went to prepare his gear and ready his mind for what was coming, because in 3 hours, Operation Guinea Fowl would begin, and there would be no turning back. Typhoon Chapter 4, The Journey North. The 2 Toyota Land Cruisers pulled out of a private compound on the outskirts of Ouagadougou precisely at 1400 hours, their civilian plates and dust-covered exteriors making them indistinguishable from the hundreds of similar vehicles that plied Burkina Faso's rural roads every day. Anyone watching would have seen what appeared to be a commercial operation, perhaps mining surveyors or agricultural consultants heading out for fieldwork. Traoré rode in the lead vehicle with Sawadogo driving, Ouedraogo in the passenger seat, and Traoré behind them managing communication equipment. The second vehicle, driven by Private Musa, carried Corporal Diallo, Sergeant Zongo, and their medical supplies and additional equipment. The vehicles were packed carefully, weapons hidden under false floors and camping equipment, ammunition distributed in ways that would be difficult to detect in a casual inspection, communications gear disguised as surveying instruments. If they were stopped at a checkpoint, their cover story was that they were conducting a geological survey for a mining company interested in the region around Bulsa. Traoré had even prepared false contracts and technical documents that would support this story. For the first hour, they drove in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts about what was coming. The landscape around Ouagadougou gradually gave way to more rural terrain as they headed north, the capital's sprawl of concrete and corrugated metal roofs replaced by scattered villages, farmland, and increasingly sparse vegetation. Traoré found himself thinking about all the other times he had traveled these roads, heading to operations, in the contested regions where insurgent groups challenged the government's authority, but those had been official missions, with proper authorization and the full weight of military support behind them. This time, he was operating in a grey zone, not quite violating orders since he had technically been given personal leave, but certainly not following the spirit of military regulations. "Penny for your thoughts, sir," Sawadogo asked, glancing over at Traoré. "Just thinking about how many variables are in play," Traoré admitted. "We're making a lot of assumptions based on limited intelligence. What if we're wrong about the location? What if they moved the hostages after sending that message? What if there are more guards than we estimated? Then we adapt," Sawadogo said simply. "That's what we're trained to do. Plan for what we know, prepare for what we suspect, and improvise when reality doesn't match either. You've led us through worse situations with less information." Ouedraogo turned in his seat. "Sir, if I may, I think you're second-guessing yourself because this is personal. When it's your family, the stakes feel higher. But objectively, this is one of the better planned operations I've been part of. We have specific intelligence, a small trained team, and a clear objective. That's more than we usually get in this war." Traoré appreciated his team's confidence, even if he didn't entirely share it. The truth was that every operation carried risks, and the personal connection to this one did make him more anxious than usual. He kept hearing his aunt's voice in his head, kept wondering what she had been trying to say when the message was cut off. They passed through 2 security checkpoints without incident, their false documentation and civilian appearance drawing only cursory inspection. At the second checkpoint, about 60 kilometers south of Bulsa, a young soldier had seemed suspicious of their story, but Cabaret had engaged him in technical conversation about mineral deposits and geological formations with such authentic expertise that the guard had waved them through with an apology for the delay. "That was close," Cabaret muttered, as they drove away from the checkpoint. "That kid was sharper than most. He was actually looking at our equipment, trying to verify our story." "Will he remember us if there are questions later?" Traoré asked. "Possibly, but by the time anyone starts asking questions, we'll either be successful and can explain everything, or unsuccessful and it won't matter what that guard remembers." They reached the outskirts of Bulsa at 17:15, 15 minutes ahead of schedule. The town was larger than Traoré had expected, perhaps 20,000 people, with a bustling market area and several paved roads radiating out towards smaller villages. It was market day, and the streets were crowded with vendors, shoppers, and vehicles of every description. "Our contact is at the fuel station on the eastern edge of town," Cabaret said, checking his phone. "We're meeting him at 17:30, so we have a few minutes to spare." They navigated through the market traffic and found the fuel station, a small operation with 2 pumps and a covered area where a few men sat drinking tea and talking. One of them stood as the Land Cruisers pulled in, a tall man in his 50s wearing traditional clothing and a white skullcap. Cabaret got out and greeted the man with elaborate formality, the two of them going through the ritual exchanges that preceded any serious conversation in Burkina Faso. Finally, they moved to a quieter corner of the station, and Traoré joined them. "This is Hamidou," Cabaret said. "He's a livestock trader who works throughout this region. I've used him as a source before. He sees things, hears things, and he's reliable." Hamidou nodded respectfully to Traoré. "The captain has told me you're looking for people who may be held at the old forestry station. I can tell you that yes, there are men there who should not be there. They arrived about a month ago, maybe 20 or 25 of them. They keep to themselves mostly, but they buy food in the market sometimes, always paying cash, never talking about what they're doing there." "Have you seen women among them?" Traoré asked. "Or heard anything about hostages?" Hamidou lowered his voice, even though they were speaking in French rather than Mooré and no one was close enough to overhear. "About 2 weeks ago, I saw them bring in new people, couldn't see clearly, but the way they were being handled, they were not there voluntarily. Since then, very quiet. No one goes near the station except the men who live there. Even the herders avoid that area now." "The herders," Corporal Diallo interjected. "Are there herding operations north of the station right now?" "Yes. My cousin's family has goats there. About 100 animals, maybe more. They set up seasonal camp about 2 kilometers from the forestry station. I can take you to them if you need to talk to them." Traoré and Cabaret exchanged glances. This was better intelligence than they had hoped for, confirmation that the site was occupied. that hostages had recently been brought there and potential local allies in the herders. "That would be very helpful," Traoré said. "We'll need to move carefully, but having someone who knows the area and can vouch for us would make things easier." They spent another 10 minutes getting detailed information from Hamidou about the terrain, the best approaches to the forestry station, and what he knew about the routines of the men occupying it. Then Hamidou climbed into the lead land cruiser, and they left Bulsa heading east on a rough dirt road that led toward the plateau. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. They passed through increasingly sparse terrain, the cultivated land around Bulsa giving way to scrubland and rocky outcroppings. After about 15 kilometers, Hamidou directed them onto an even rougher track that led north toward the seasonal grazing lands. They found the herders' camp just as dusk was beginning to deepen into twilight. 3 large tents made of woven mats and cloth, a cooking area with a fire burning low, and several crude pens where goats milled about, their bells creating that familiar metallic clanging that Traoré had heard in his aunt's message. An elderly man emerged from one of the tents, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw Hamidou. The 2 men embraced and spoke rapidly in Moore, too fast and colloquial for Traoré to follow with his limited knowledge of the language. Finally, Hamidou turned back to Traoré. "This is my cousin, Boubacar. I've explained that you're looking for people who may be held at the forestry station. He says his family has seen suspicious activity there for weeks. They're frightened of the men. Armed strangers are never good news in the Sahel, but they're also angry because the presence of those men has made their traditional grazing lands dangerous." Boubacar spoke again, and Hamidou translated. He says 3 nights ago, they heard a woman screaming from the direction of the station. His wife wanted to go investigate, but he forbade it. Too dangerous. But the sound has haunted them. If you're planning to help whoever is being held there, his family will assist however they can. Traoré felt a chill run through him. A woman screaming 3 nights ago. That would have been shortly after the voice message was sent. Had his aunt been hurt, punished for something, or was it one of the other hostages? "Tell him we appreciate his willingness to help," Traoré said carefully. "Chas, we're planning to approach the station tonight and try to rescue anyone being held against their will. If his family could do one thing, keep their goats in this area for the next several hours. We need those bells to continue, as they have been, to maintain the normal sounds of the environment. Any sudden change might alert the men at the station that something is wrong." Hamidou translated, and Boubacar nodded vigorously, speaking again. He says, "The bells will ring all night as usual. And if you need a place to treat injured people after your rescue, his camp is safe. His wives know herbal medicine and basic care." "Thank you," Traoré said, genuine gratitude in his voice. This was the Burkina Faso he believed in. Ordinary people helping each other in the face of violence and chaos. Communities supporting each other when official institutions failed. They left the herders and camp and drove the final few kilometers to the observation position Caboret had identified on the maps. It was a cluster of large boulders about 800 meters east of the forestry station, positioned on a slight rise that gave them a clear line of sight to the compound while providing excellent cover. Private Moussa expertly navigated the land cruisers into a depression behind the rocks, where they would be invisible from the forestry station. The team unloaded their equipment quietly and efficiently, and within 10 minutes, they had established their observation post. Traoré crawled to the edge of the rocks and raised binoculars to his eyes, bringing the forestry station into focus as the last light of day faded into the deep blue of dusk. Thursday 1 Chapter 5. Eyes on Target. Through the binoculars, the forestry station resolved into sharp detail despite the gathering darkness. 4 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, exactly as the satellite photos had shown. But now Traoré could see movement. Figures moving between buildings, the flicker of lights through windows, smoke rising from what appeared to be a cooking fire in the courtyard. Caboret set up a spotting scope on a tripod, its powerful optics and light-gathering capabilities superior to handheld binoculars. He adjusted the focus carefully, then began a systematic survey of the compound, making notes on a pad beside him. Main building, western side of the courtyard. That's where most of the activity is concentrated, he narrated quietly. I count 7 individuals visible currently, all male, all armed. Mix of assault rifles and what look like older hunting weapons. Corporal Diallo had set up a night vision scope and was scanning a different section of the compound. Northern building shows no external activity, but I can see light through cracks in the shutters. That might be where they're keeping hostages, somewhere they can control access and limit visibility. Ouedraogo was drawing a detailed sketch of the compound layout, adding details that hadn't been visible in the satellite imagery. Perimeter fence is in bad shape on the east and south sides. Big gaps where the wire has rusted through or been torn down. Could be useful for infiltration. Western approach has a clear field of fire from the main building, though. That's their strong side. For the next hour, they watched and documented everything they could see. The compound's routines gradually became clear. Guards changed position every 30 minutes, but their patrol patterns were predictable and left gaps in coverage. Cooking activities were centered in the courtyard, with men gathering around the fire to eat in shifts. The northern building, the one Diallo had identified as a likely hostage location, remained sealed, with no one entering or leaving during their observation period. As full darkness settled over the plateau, the compound's lights became more visible. They had electricity, probably from the diesel generator they had heard in the voice message, but the power was limited, with only a few buildings lit, and those only dimly. "I make it 17 hostiles visible so far," Traoré reported, updating his count. "Could be more inside buildings we can't see into. Weapons count is at least 12 assault rifles, multiple sidearms, and what might be an RPG or similar weapon near the main building." "Vehicle count?" Traoré asked. 4 vehicles that I can see clearly, 2 trucks and 2 SUVs, all positioned on the western side of the compound. Could be more parked out of our line of sight." Ouedraogo had been studying the approach routes with topographical maps and night vision equipment. "Sir, I recommend we approach from the northeast. There's a natural depression that runs within 200 meters of the northern building, the one we think holds the hostages. We can use it for cover almost all the way to the perimeter fence, and from there it's only about 50 meters of exposed ground to reach the building." Traoré studied the approach carefully through his binoculars. "That's also the side where the fence is in worst shape. We could cut through quietly without making much noise, but once we're inside the perimeter, we're committed. If they spot us before we reach the building, we'll be caught in the open." "What about a distraction?" suggested Corporal Diallo. "And if we could draw guards away from the northern side, create some kind of commotion on the opposite side of the compound, that would improve our odds significantly." It was a good idea, but Traoré was reluctant to split their small force. They were already outnumbered at least 3 to 1. Dividing their strength further seemed risky. "Let me think about it," he said. "For now, let's continue observation. I want to get a sense of their night routines. Do they maintain the same guard levels after dark, or do they scale back assuming no one would attack at night?" As they watched, the activity in the compound gradually decreased. Men finished eating and retreated into buildings. The guard presence remained constant. Traoré counted at least 4 guards visible at any given time, positioned at corners of the compound with overlapping fields of observation. Around 9 p.m., something happened that made Traoré's pulse quicken. The door to the northern building, the suspected hostage location, opened. A man emerged carrying what looked like a bucket, walked to the central courtyard, filled it from a water tank, and returned to the building. The door was open for perhaps 30 seconds, and in that brief window, Traoré thought he saw movement inside. Someone approaching the door, maybe reaching out for the water. "Did you see that?" he asked Traoré urgently. "Yes. Someone inside that building definitely moved toward the door when it opened. Multiple someones, actually. I saw at least 2 distinct shadows." "Hostages," Traoré said with certainty. "They're in there. We found them." But finding them and rescuing them were 2 different challenges. He pulled his team back from the observation position to discuss the assault plan. They gathered in a tight circle behind the rocks, speaking in whispers even though they were far enough from the compound that normal conversation wouldn't carry. Traoré spread out a hand-drawn map of the compound that Ouedraogo had created, marking guard positions and approach routes. "Here's what I'm thinking," he began. 2 teams. Team 1, myself, Ouedraogo and Ouedraogo, approaches from the northeast using the depression for cover. Our objective is to reach the northern building, breach it quietly if possible, and secure the hostages. Team 2, Traoré, Diallo, and Zongo, positions here on the eastern ridge with the vehicles. You provide overwatch with precision fire capability. If we're compromised, you engage guards to cover our extraction. Musa stays with the vehicles, engines running, ready for immediate evacuation. Cabaret studied the map. What about communication once you're inside the perimeter? Standard radios might be picked up if they're monitoring frequencies. We'll use tactical hand signals for as long as possible, Traoré replied. Radio silence unless absolutely necessary. I'll carry a phone on vibrate. If you need to warn us about something, send a text message with a single letter, D for danger, C for clear, E for emergency extraction needed. Sergeant Zongo raised a practical concern. Sir, what condition should we expect the hostages to be in? If they've been held for weeks, they may not be able to move quickly. We might need to carry them out, which complicates the timeline significantly. Good point. We'll have to assess on the ground. Worst case, Sawadogo and I carry hostages while Uedraogo provides close security. Team 2 suppresses any pursuit until we reach the vehicles. They work through the plan in detail, identifying potential problems and developing contingencies. The biggest risk was the exposed ground between the perimeter fence and the northern building. 50 meters wasn't far, but crossing it unseen would require careful timing and, frankly, luck. What if we wait until later? Corporal Diallo suggested. After midnight, when fatigue starts affecting the guards, people are naturally less alert in the dead hours before dawn. Traoré considered it, but shook his head. The longer we wait, the more time for something to go wrong. And we don't know if the kidnappers plan to contact me tonight or early tomorrow morning. If they call and I don't answer, or if they somehow detect that I'm not in Ouagadougou, it could spook them into moving the hostages or worse. He checked his watch, 2100 hours, 9 p.m. We move at 21:30. That gives us 30 minutes to prepare equipment, conduct final checks, and get into position. Questions? Sawadogo had one. Rules of engagement, sir. We talked about this in the briefing, but I want to be absolutely clear before we're in the middle of it. Lethal force is authorized in defense of hostages or team members, Traoré reiterated, but our primary objective is rescue, not combat. If we can avoid firefights, we do so. If guards surrender or retreat, we let them. The only enemies we need to neutralize are those actively threatening the hostages or blocking our extraction. And if the hostages include insurgents using them as human shields? Ouedraogo asked quietly. It was the nightmare scenario, hostages deliberately positioned to make rescue attempts deadly for the captives themselves. Traoré had seen it before in other operations. Then we adapt. We fall back, regroup, and find another way. But let's not assume the worst until we know what we're dealing with. They spent the next 25 minutes in final preparations. Weapons were checked and rechecked, ammunition distributed, communication protocols tested, medical supplies staged for quick access. Traoré found himself going through the familiar pre-combat ritual, checking his gear obsessively, running through mental scenarios, preparing his mind for the violence and chaos that might come. At 21:25, he gathered Team 1 for a final brief. Remember, speed and silence are our advantages. Once we're inside that building, we move fast, identify hostages, verify their condition, and get them out. Maximum time inside the compound, 10 minutes. After that, even if we haven't found everyone, we extract with whoever we have. Sawadogo and Ouedraogo nodded, their faces painted with camouflage grease, their weapons held with the easy familiarity of soldiers who had trained together for years. One more thing, Traoré added quietly. If something happens to me, if I go down, Sawadogo takes command. Complete the mission. Get the hostages out. Don't stop to help me if it compromises their safety. Understood. Understood, sir, Sawadogo replied, though his expression made clear he didn't like the order. At 21:30 exactly, Team 1 moved out, leaving the observation post and beginning their approach toward the forestry station. Team 2 repositioned to their overwatch location, Caboret setting up a precision rifle with night vision scope, while Diallo managed communications and Zongo prepared medical equipment. Traoré led the way down into the depression that would shield their approach, moving carefully in the darkness, testing each footfall before committing his weight. Behind him, Sawadogo and Ouedraogo moved with equal caution, their footsteps silent despite the rocky terrain. The depression ran roughly northeast to southwest, parallel to the forestry station's perimeter. As they moved along it, Traoré could occasionally glimpse the compound through gaps in the terrain. Lights in windows, shadows of guards moving across open ground, the faint sound of voices carried on the night wind. After 15 minutes of careful movement, they reached the point closest to the northern building. Traoré raised his hand, signaling a halt, and the team dropped into prone positions. He belly-crawled the last few meters to the edge of the depression and studied the situation. The perimeter fence was about 20 meters away, its rusted wire barely visible in the darkness. Beyond it, 50 meters of open ground led to the northern building. A guard was visible on the western side of the compound, but his attention seemed focused inward, toward the courtyard. Traoré felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out carefully, shielding the screen's light with his hand. A text from Cabaret. 2 guards near your target building, 1 north corner, 1 west. Pattern suggests they rotate every 30 minutes. Next rotation in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. They needed to time this perfectly. Cross the exposed ground during the rotation when guards were in transition and potentially less alert. He texted back, "Copy. Moving on your signal." They waited, muscles tense, breathing controlled, every sense heightened by adrenaline and focus. Traoré thought about his aunt on the other side of that fence, imprisoned in that building, probably terrified, possibly hurt, so close, yet still separated by 50 meters that might as well have been 50 kilometers if they got the timing wrong. His phone vibrated again. Guards moving 30 seconds. Traoré tapped Sawadogo and Ouédraogo, pointing toward the fence. They rose to a crouch, ready to move. Another text. "Clear. Go now." They went. Chapter 6. The Breach. The 20 meters to the fence felt like 20 kilometers. Every step seemed to echo impossibly loud in Traoré's ears, though he knew objectively that their movement was nearly silent. His eyes scanned constantly, checking the guard positions, watching for movement, preparing to drop flat if anyone looked their direction. They reached the fence without incident. Ouédraogo was already pulling wire cutters from his pack, working on the rusted links with practiced efficiency. The fence was in such poor condition that the wire parted with barely any resistance, creating a gap large enough for them to slip through one at a time. Traoré went first, rolling through the opening and immediately taking a prone position on the other side, his rifle trained on the nearest corner of the compound. Sawadogo followed then Ouédraogo, who paused to carefully arrange the cut fence so it wasn't immediately obvious that it had been breached. Now came the dangerous part, 50 meters of open ground with no cover and minimal concealment. The only thing in their favor was darkness, and the guards' apparent confidence that no one would be foolish enough to attack their position. Traoré signaled his team to spread out slightly, not in a line, which would make them a single target, but staggered so that if one was spotted, the others might still remain undetected. Then he began to low crawl across the open space, moving with agonizing slowness, pausing every few seconds to scan for threats. The ground was rough, scattered with small rocks that pressed into his arms and legs as he crawled. The night air carried the smell of cooking fires, diesel fuel, and the particular scent of habitation, unwashed bodies, waste, the accumulated odors of men living in close quarters without proper sanitation. 20 meters, 30 meters, 40 meters. A guard emerged from the main building, walking toward the northern structure where the hostages were held. Traoré froze instantly, making himself as flat as possible against the ground. Beside him, Sawadogo and Ouédraogo had done the same, becoming dark shapes indistinguishable from rocks or shadows. The guard walked past, no more than 15 meters away, so close that Traoré could hear him muttering to himself in Arabic. He was young, maybe 20, carrying his rifle carelessly across one shoulder like it was a burden rather than a tool. He approached the door of the northern building, knocked twice, hit and called out something that Traoré couldn't quite make out. The door opened a crack. Another guard appeared, older, more alert. They spoke for a moment. Then the younger guard handed something through the door. Food, Traoré realized. They were bringing food to whoever was guarding the hostages inside. The exchange took less than a minute. Then both guards retreated, the younger one back toward the main building, the older one presumably back inside with the hostages. The door closed with a solid thud. Traoré waited 5 more seconds, then resumed his crawl. Only 10 meters to go now. He could see details of the northern building, the weathered wood of its walls, the barred windows, the heavy padlock on the exterior of the door. Padlock? That meant the door was secured from outside, which suggested the guard wasn't actually inside with the hostages. They were locked in, and the guard was probably stationed just outside, protecting access rather than directly watching the prisoners. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably less than 10 minutes, Traoré reached the wall of the northern building. He pressed himself against it, weapon ready, heart hammering. Ouedraogo and Ouedraogo joined him seconds later, taking positions on either side of the door. Now they needed to determine exactly what they were dealing with. Traoré moved carefully along the wall until he reached one of the barred windows. He rose slowly, keeping his profile minimal, and peered through the bars into the darkened interior. At first, he could see nothing. The room inside was darker than the night outside. But as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to resolve. People. Several people sitting or lying on the floor. One figure moved slightly, and Traoré caught a glimpse of a woman's profile. His aunt. He recognized her even in the poor light, the familiar shape of her face, the way she held herself even in captivity. Relief flooded through him, so powerful it almost made him dizzy. She was alive. They had found her. Now they just needed to get her out. He moved back to where Ouedraogo and Ouedraogo waited by the door. 4 hostages visible. He whispered directly into Ouedraogo's ear, his voice barely audible even at that proximity. Aunt Fatoumata and 3 others. Room appears to have 1 exit. This door. Padlocked from outside. Ouedraogo examined the padlock with a small penlight, shielding the light carefully. He held up 4 fingers. It would take him approximately 4 minutes to pick the lock. Too long. Too much exposure. Ouedraogo had a different idea. He pointed to the hinges on the door, old rusted, visible on the exterior. Instead of picking the lock, they could remove the hinges and take the entire door off its frame. Traoré nodded approval. It was faster, quieter than breaching, and would work even with the padlock in place. While Ouedraogo went to work on the hinges with a small pry bar, Traoré texted an update to Caboret. At target building. Hostages confirmed. Breaching in 3 minutes. Be ready for immediate extraction. The response came back immediately. Copy. All clear, currently. 1 guard patrol approaching from west. ETA 2 minutes. 2 minutes. They needed to be inside and secured before that patrol arrived. Ouedraogo worked with intense focus, his tools making tiny scraping sounds that seemed impossibly loud to Traoré's heightened senses. The top hinge came free, then the middle hinge. Finally, the bottom. Ready, Ouedraogo whispered. Traoré gripped one side of the door, while Ouedraogo took the other. On a 3 count, they lifted it carefully away from the frame, the padlock still securing it to nothing. They set the door aside as quietly as possible and faced the now open entrance. Inside, a woman gasped. Traoré heard movement, scrambling sounds, as the hostages reacted to the unexpected opening. "Please, don't hurt us," a voice pleaded in French. "Sad, we've done everything you asked." "Aunt Fatoumata," Traoré said quietly but clearly, stepping into the doorway with his hands visible and weapon lowered. "It's Ibrahim. We're here to get you out." There was a moment of absolute silence. Then his aunt's voice, unshaking with emotion. "Ibrahim, how did you find us?" "I'll explain later," Traoré said, moving into the room with Ouedraogo and Ouedraogo following, the latter taking up a guard position at the entrance. "Right now, we need to move quickly and quietly. Can everyone walk?" His eyes had adjusted enough to see the 4 hostages clearly now. His aunt, looking thinner and more haggard than he remembered but apparently uninjured. 2 men, 1 middle-aged and 1 elderly, both showing signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. And a younger woman, perhaps in her 30s, who had spoken first. "We can walk," Fatoumata said, her voice gaining strength. "But Ibrahim, you need to know there's something they're planning. Something they made me tell you in that message. Something about—" "Later, Aunt. We're in enemy territory with limited time. Tell me on the way out." He helped her to her feet. "Everyone, stay close together. If shooting starts, get flat on the ground immediately. We have vehicles waiting about 800 meters from here. Can you make that distance?" All 4 hostages nodded, though the elderly man looked unsteady on his feet. Sergeant Zongo would need to evaluate them as soon as they reached the vehicles, but first they had to survive the extraction. Traoré positioned the hostages between himself and Ouedraogo, with Ouedraogo taking rear guard. They moved to the doorway and paused while Traoré checked his phone. A message from Traoré. Guard patrol delayed. Window open for 90 seconds. Suggest immediate movement. 90 seconds. They needed to cross 50 meters of open ground with 4 weakened hostages in 90 seconds. Double time, Traoré whispered to his team. Support the hostages, but keep moving. Go. They burst from the building, not quite running, but moving as fast as the hostages could manage. Traoré had his aunt's arm, helping her across the rough ground. Sawadogo was supporting the elderly man. The other 2 hostages moved on their own, fear lending them speed despite their weakened condition. 20 meters, 30 meters, they were exposed, vulnerable, every second expecting shouts of alarm or the crack of gunfire. 40 meters, almost to the fence. Traoré could see the cut section where they had entered, could see freedom just beyond. A shout from behind them. Not directed at them, but close enough to make Traoré's blood run cold. Someone had discovered the open door of the northern building. Faster, he urged, all pretense of stealth abandoned now. They needed distance, needed to get through the fence before the alarm was fully raised. The hostages scrambled through the fence opening. Traoré practically threw his aunt through, then helped the elderly man who was struggling with the gap. Sawadogo and Ouedraogo had their weapons up, covering their retreat. More shouts now, closer, running footsteps, the unmistakable sound of rifles being readied. "Everyone through," Ouedraogo called. "Going loud in 3, 2... Gunfire erupted from the compound, muzzle flashes bright in the darkness, but the shots were wild, undisciplined. The guards were shooting at sounds and shadows, not clear targets. From their overwatch position, Caboré's precision rifle answered with single, carefully aimed shots. One guard dropped, another took cover. The suppressing fire wasn't meant to kill everyone, just to force heads down, to buy precious seconds. Traoré's team made it to the depression and dropped into cover, the hostages huddled between them. Now they just needed to move 800 meters through darkness, with an alerted enemy behind them, and 4 civilians who could barely walk.